Hey everyone, most of you are aware of my recent live debate dunking on anti-vax charlatans Steve Kirsch and Pierre Kory. I promised follow-up videos on each of them to further expose their fraudulence, and with Steve already covered, we move on to Pierre. If you saw the carnage that was the live debate, you know exactly who Pierre is. But if you missed it and you haven't heard of him before, here's the quick rundown. Most of us became familiar with a drug called Ivermectin during the pandemic, and the reason for that is Pierre Kory. Pierre is the ICU doctor turned misinformation mogul who has spent the last 5 years peddling Ivermectin, an anti-parasitic, as a miracle drug for COVID, even though he had no firm evidence for the claim when he first made it, and it was then quickly proven to be totally ineffective. He made a lot of money off of that grift, but any good grifter knows how to pivot when the time comes. So he eventually started branching into all manner of anti-vax conspiracies, bogus claims about measles deaths not being from measles, weaponized viruses, and more. You may remember from the debate how Pierre was trying to pretend that some kids who died of measles in Texas didn't actually die of measles. Then Dan and I humiliated him by explaining immune amnesia, where the measles virus destroys previously acquired immunity for a variety of pathogenic bacteria, leading to severe secondary bacterial infections. So the bacteria he was whining about wouldn't have infected those kids if they hadn't been infected with measles, which wouldn't have happened if they had been vaccinated. More on that later when we illustrate how Pierre has shifted from lying about ivermectin to just peddling generalized science denial regarding vaccines and infectious diseases. He's also part of RFK's cabal of disinformation superspreaders, most of whom now sell snake oil, like Pierre's pal Mickey Willis and his measles treatment and prevention protocol, which is just a bunch of pointless supplements for hundreds of dollars. This is somehow supposed to be more desirable than preventing measles with the typically free MMR vaccine, which has been proven to be profoundly safe and effective for decades, to the point where measles had been declared eradicated until this most recent wave of extreme vaccine hesitancy, which has swept the nation thanks to frauds like Pierre. Now, the interesting thing is that Pierre Kory wasn't always this fringe grifter douchebag. He was once a legitimate ICU physician. He was board certified in critical care, pulmonary disease, and internal medicine. But then COVID hit, and for Pierre, so did the spotlight. In April of 2020, he co-founded the Frontline COVID-19 Critical Care Alliance, or FLCCC, with his colleague, Paul Merrick. They published 2 protocols, Math Plus and iMask Plus, intended for treating hospitalized COVID patients and prevention of COVID illness, respectively. They specifically touted ivermectin as life-saving early in the pandemic, but as data began to shed doubt on its effectiveness, it quickly became obvious that this was nothing but a marketing scheme. Nevertheless, Pierre became a household name later that year when he testified before the U.S. Senate's Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs Committee, branding himself as a pharma whistleblower and declaring that ivermectin is effectively a miracle drug against COVID-19. This was his big moment, so let's get some highlights.
We have now come to the conclusion, after 9 months, and I have to point out, I am severely troubled by the fact that the NIH, the FDA, and the CDC, I do not know of any task force that was assigned or compiled to review repurposed drugs in an attempt to treat this disease. Everything has been about novel and/or expensive pharmaceutically engineered drugs, things like tocilizumab and remdesivir and monoclonal antibodies and vaccines. There is a drug that is proving to be of miraculous impact. And when I say miracle, I do not use that term lightly. And I don't want to be sensationalized when I say that. That is a scientific recommendation based on mountains of data that has emerged in the last 3 months. When I am told, and I just had to hear this in the opening sentence, that we are touting things that are not FDA or NIH recommended, let me be clear. The NIH, their recommendation on ivermectin, which is to not use it outside of controlled trials, is from August 27th. We are now in December. This is 3 to 4 months later. Mountains of data have emerged from many centers and countries around the world showing the miraculous effectiveness of ivermectin. It basically obliterates transmission of this virus. If you take it, you will not get sick. We have evidence that ivermectin is effective not only in prophylaxis, in the prevention. If you take it, you will not get sick. We just came across a trial last night from Argentina by the lead investigator of ivermectin in Argentina, Dr. Hector Carvalho. They prophylaxed 800 healthcare workers. Not one got sick. We now have 4 large randomized controlled trials totaling over 1,500 patients, each trial showing that as a prophylaxis agent, it is immensely effective. You will not get sick. You will be protected from getting ill if you take it. In early outpatient treatment, we have 3 randomized controlled trials and multiple observation as well as case series showing that if you take ivermectin, the need for hospitalization and death will decrease. It is proving to be a wonder drug. It is critical for its use in this disease. Any further deaths are going to be needless deaths, and I cannot be traumatized by that. I am not here as a politician or a dramatist or sensationalizing what I'm recommending. You know who's dying here? It's our African American and Latino and elderly. It's some of the most disadvantaged and impoverished members of our society. They are dying at higher rates than anyone else. It's the most severe discrepancy I've seen in my medical career. And we are responsible to protect those disadvantaged members. We have a special duty to provide countermeasures. The amount of evidence to show that ivermectin is life-saving and protective is so immense, and the drug is so safe. My colleagues have talked about it. It must be instituted and implemented. I am asking the NIH to review our data and come up with recommendations for society.
Pretty bold claims there, Pierre. There's just one problem. His so-called evidence came exclusively from unreviewed preprints, low-quality observational studies, and unverifiable anecdotes. What he called mountains of data collapsed into dust the moment anyone actually followed up on anything. Plenty of professionals spoke up to expose Pierre's lies, but since Dan Wilson of Debunked the Funk so masterfully humiliated Pierre in our debate, let's give him the honors this time around as well. This video is from December of 2020, about a week after Pierre ran his mouth.
Currently, there are no published, peer-reviewed studies showing that this drug, ivermectin, has any effectiveness in preventing COVID-19. However, there are a few preprint studies that show that there might be an effect here. Now, keep in mind, these papers are not peer-reviewed. That does not make them wrong, but it does mean we should be cautious in interpreting their meaning. So with that in mind, when we read the results of these papers, we can see that even though their sample sizes are small, there does appear to be a decrease in COVID cases in groups that were treated with ivermectin. So right away, 2 takeaways we can see from these studies is that, 1, it is not 100% effective. So this doctor saying that if you take ivermectin, you will not get sick is sensationalist, that is misleading, and he should not be saying that. We can also see that there might be an effect here, but we don't know for sure. These results are far from conclusive, and we would have to see much larger studies in order to make any strong conclusions and recommendations based off those results.
They prophylaxed 800 healthcare workers. Not one got sick.
I can't find this paper published on any preprint server or anywhere, so I can't really comment on it, which means that he probably shouldn't be talking about it in front of Congress because, again, it's not peer-reviewed and it's not verified by the scientific community yet.
It is proving to be a wonder drug.
No, it's not, and the simple reason is that the evidence is much too thin at this point to be making such a huge statement. Not only are the existing studies few in number and low in quality, but another thing that complicates these results is that these patients weren't just receiving ivermectin, they were also receiving other medications alongside it. So it's hard to say how effective ivermectin really is in these cases. At the end of the day, we just need more studies in order to say whether or not it's effective. And we certainly can't say that it's a wonder drug. I mean, don't say that.
Please, I'm just asking that they review our manuscript.
And like we said, that takes time. Submitted manuscripts are being reviewed, and more clinical trials are underway. But he knows that, which is why it's hard for me to believe that he's not here as a dramatist to sensationalize the idea that this medicine might have some effect in treating COVID-19. I can't say why he's doing this, but I can say that it is utterly irresponsible.
As you can see, Pierre's testimony wasn't about any scientific breakthrough. It was the official launch of the FLCCC's iMask Plus protocol, a cocktail of vitamins, melatonin, and ivermectin that Pierre baselessly claimed could prevent and cure COVID. It was a marketing campaign, hence the precise sensationalism he explicitly claimed he wasn't engaging in. He said there were over 20 well-designed studies, 10 randomized, all showing dramatic benefits. That's a lie. Not embellishment, not hyperbole, it's a lie. There were 0 randomized controlled trials at the time that he made that statement. Dan proved this in my video on the debate. There was no peer-reviewed research of any kind demonstrating what Pierre is claiming at the time that he gave this testimony. None. Just a handful of unpublished preprints with small sample sizes and without proper randomization that didn't control for confounders like other medications taken simultaneously, and even those hinted at minor or inconsistent effects. Not the sweeping 100% prevention claim he pulled out of his asshole while under oath. Not a mountain of data, not even a molehill, just a house of cards. And he made sure to sell the idea of prophylaxis, or action taken to prevent disease, in addition to treatment. This is because he knew that he'd make the most money by convincing people to take ivermectin every week for an indefinite period of time. And it gets worse. Independent reviews later confirmed that many of the preliminary studies Pierre was referencing were misrepresented or outright fraudulent. For example, the Egyptian El Ghazar et al. Preprint he leaned on was retracted for concerns regarding data fabrication and plagiarism. I wonder why someone would do a thing like that. Another example, which ended up being the nail in the coffin for his Math Plus protocol, was his inaccurate reporting of data from Centara Norfolk General Hospital, which called him out for misreporting hospital mortality data. This passage explains in detail how Pierre fabricated the figures he reported, so I'll link to this retraction notice if you want to read the whole thing, plus a few other notices of retractions, corrections, and expressions of concern from major journals. Didn't think the hospital would catch you telling lies, eh, Pierre? This is where a normal person, temporarily led astray by delusions of grandeur, would bite the bullet, accept the loss, and quietly back away from the spotlight. But not Pierre. Now firmly committed to his new grifting lifestyle, he decided to bitch about it endlessly on the internet, acting like a complete toddler and blaming everyone else rather than taking responsibility for his lies like a fucking adult. Never-ending tweets, spewing jargon to try to muddy the waters and provide some kind of plausible narrative as to how everyone is wrong but him, complete with non-stop whining about mainstream collective thinking and censorship of alternative approaches. Apart from this narrative being objectively false, since cheap generics like dexamethasone were indeed repurposed to treat COVID, the precise thing he is pretending was prevented by evil money-grubbing pharma, this is just the general script a grifter uses to get the gullible masses to accept their lies over the facts that are agreed upon by every expert in the world. Look at this pathetic Twitter interaction with Andrew Hill, whose meta-analysis Pierre cited to claim ivermectin works. Hill reevaluated his work after studies in the meta-analysis were shown to be fraudulent, so he set the record straight. In response, Pierre throws a public tantrum, accuses a diligent researcher of being a paid shill, gets a shit ton of likes and retweets, and what happens? Daily death threats to Andrew Hill and his entire team. This happened to healthcare workers everywhere. Constant harassment which contributed to increased healthcare worker burnout and mental health issues during the pandemic. You have earnest public health servants throwing themselves off the roof of hospitals due to the trauma of being surrounded by a sea of death, most of which could have been prevented by vaccination once available. And the ones who stuck it out were harassed endlessly by the minions of frauds like Pierre, who capitalized on human lives to fill his own pockets. This is what the anti-vax cult is. They clutch their pearls about imaginary corruption that claims millions of imaginary lives, while at the same time physically threatening the lives of well-intentioned medical professionals actually helping real people in the real world. The delusion and hypocrisy is off the charts. So to summarize, when the noise was stripped away from Pierre's bullshit claims, systematic reviews, including Cochrane's in 2022, found no reliable evidence that ivermectin prevented infection, shortened illness, or saved lives, which has since been echoed by the World Health Organization and National Institutes of Health, which only recommended use in clinical trials. The medical community, being as open-minded as it is, did indeed run run large double-blind randomized controlled trials, like the Active-6 sample size of 1,300 and Together sample size of 1,500. These studies confirmed the same result. Ivermectin offers no meaningful benefit in the context of recovery, hospitalization, or death. The better and more thorough the science, the weaker the results became. Countless studies, low dose, high dose, early treatment, extended treatment, you name it. Every legitimate study showed that ivermectin does jack shit to treat or prevent COVID. Even Pierre's mechanistic pitch that ivermectin kills the virus in vitro turned out to rely on lab doses more than 35 times higher than what people actually observe in blood after oral ingestion while fasting. Here's the study Pierre was flexing. Inhibits replication of the virus in vitro. Then the follow-up study, which shows that the concentrations with inhibitory effects were 35 times greater than the maximum plasma concentrations. That's an amount that would kill a person. And rest assured, people did overdose and die from ivermectin. Funny how there's no outrage for those casualties, huh? So when Pierre told Congress that all studies show positive statistically significant benefits, that was a lie. He was lying like a liar. The reality is the precise opposite. From a starting point of unverifiable weak evidence, the better the trials got, the smaller the effect became, until it vanished altogether. Pierre's insistence that ivermectin obliterates transmission wasn't just totally baseless, it was reckless, and it was a claim that was made with one result in mind: profit. His testimony was a free commercial for his grift, which promptly landed him on the conspiracy podcast circuit with frauds like Brett Weinstein and gullible idiots like Joe Rogan, which Pierre milked for all they're worth to launch his business hawking ivermectin on the internet, which made him filthy rich by the time the pandemic died down. And here we are in 2025. Despite Pierre's continued insistence that ivermectin is the bee's knees for COVID, in the reality shared by professionals who care about facts, ivermectin's obituary is official. Annals 2025, no effect on outcomes in 7,035 patients. Antibiotics 2025, no difference in viral clearance. Cochrane 2025, low certainty evidence, no measurable benefit. In other words, Pierre's miracle never materialized. He calls it censorship. The rest of us call it accountability. Science didn't silence him. In fact, every jerk who claims they're being censored seems to be shouting about it on every gigantic platform they can find. Science looked at his claims and found them to be objectively false. And lying is the least of Pierre's transgressions. As we said, his relentless promotion of ivermectin for profit contributed immeasurable harm. Let's start with the poisonings. Dozens of very serious adverse reactions, including a handful of deaths, and this is limited to what was reported to one particular database. Here's a report from Oregon of 5 people hospitalized from ivermectin use. Then from September 2021, we can see official reports that the doses recommended by frauds on the internet are way too high and can cause health problems. Does any of that stop the anti-vax cult from endangering themselves with ludicrous doses of an off-label drug while endangering others by not getting vaccinated? Of course not. If experts say it, it must be a lie, you stupid sheep. Then let's not forget that ivermectin is a legitimate drug with an important function as an antiparasitic. Do you think that many thousands of people getting tricked into buying it to treat COVID could result in some kind of shortage of the drug for people who actually need it for their parasitic infections? Of course it would. Increased demand caused shortages for patients with scabies and other parasites, and this disproportionately impacted vulnerable populations, the ones Pierre made a point to reference, as though he gives a shit about any particular demographic and wasn't just white knighting for social karma points. Then don't forget all the thousands of victims who couldn't find ivermectin for people because it was in short supply, so they went with veterinary ivermectin instead. Countless simpletons flocked farm and feed supply stores, bought this stuff and took it like it was for people, which also caused a wave of overdoses, as well as shortages for livestock that need it. FDA and CDC issued warnings about this activity, even trying their best to speak directly on the level of these morons, with tweets reading, "You are not a horse. You are not a cow. Seriously, y'all, stop it." Should have been pretty relatable, no? Even idiot anti-vaxxers understand that they are not horses, right? But no, the evil government is lying again. Grab that horse paste and lather yourself up, Cletus. Poison centers were inundated with calls due to veterinary ivermectin misuse. Many patients were hospitalized and some died. And then, most importantly, delayed care. Thousands of unvaccinated people with COVID fell for the ivermectin scam, waited patiently while their condition worsened for pills to come in the mail that weren't going to help them at all, and weeks later, in critical condition, finally realizing that ivermectin doesn't do shit against COVID, it was too late. Nobody at the hospital could help them. They gasped their last few breaths in a state of confused panic, and they died. We may never know precisely how many people fit this description, but it is a huge number. Obviously, I would never suggest that anecdotal evidence is some kind of gold standard, but it's worth something, and there are countless testimonies from healthcare providers outlining the overwhelming number of cases of delayed care where people arrived at the hospital already in critical condition because they attempted to self-treat with unproven remedies like ivermectin and hydroxychloroquine. The disinformation spread by Pierre and others like him claimed a lot of lives, and he has zero remorse about it, because he's a grifting, money-hungry sociopath. Was there any backlash for this jerk? Of course there was. In August 2024, the American Board of Internal Medicine revoked the medical certifications of Pierre Kory and Paul Marik for spreading COVID misinformation. That's the medical community's version of a red card for fouling the facts. When you continue to tell millions that ivermectin obliterates COVID, even after mountains of high-quality evidence shows otherwise, you're not just wrong, you're lying, and you're dangerous. If you were in the ICU, intubated, critically ill, and unable to consent to anything, would you want Pierre doing experimental treatments on you for self-enrichment, treating you like an expendable statistic for his own personal gain, withholding treatments with good evidence of success because of his own fucked up agenda? Of course not. That's why Pierre isn't allowed to be a doctor anymore. Not because Big Pharma, Rockefeller, academia, something. But common sense doesn't stop frauds like Pierre from leaning even harder into their grift. After all, when mainstream science tries to cancel you, it can only be because your truth is way too truthy for them to handle, right? Fast forward to present day, and Pierre has officially gone full anti-vax crank. He sells books full of lies. He promotes spike detox supplements like nattokinase, the one that made Steve Kirsch blind in one eye, even though Pierre denied it during our debate. He charges outrageous fees for telehealth and vaccine injury sessions. Here's his Twitter profile, which advertises telehealth right at the top. And here's his website, with all the consultation types listed, including one for medications on hand, where he hawks his bogus products. And of course, he's now quite the public figure, given his heroic fight to save the masses from evil Big Pharma. So he frequently speaks at events like the very recent Children's Health Defense Moment of Truth conference. This is the propaganda organization that RFK Jr. led for 8 years, on the way to becoming the world's most powerful and influential anti-vaxxer. And he has essentially become the Pied Piper of anti-vax frauds at this point, with virtually every grifting anti-vaxxer on the internet getting brought into the fold. Let's check out the roster for this little PR stunt, conference. There's Joseph Ladapo, the Florida Surgeon General who compares vaccine mandates to slavery. This is the dickhead who, along with Governor Ron DeSantis, is in the process of repealing vaccine mandates for school children for all of Florida, which will 100% result in child deaths. Senators Ron Johnson and Rand Paul, who accused Fauci of creating the coronavirus and being a traitor to the United States who should be jailed for life. A video about the cartoonish Fauci fervor is coming soon. Russell Brand, the English comedian who got caught sexually assaulting and raping everything that moves. So he found Jesus and pivoted to conservative grifting, since the right protects rapists and pedophiles, especially if they're white and Christian. I covered this douchebag in one of my Terry videos, so watch that for some laughs. Suzanne Humphries, the fraud who appeared on Joe Rogan pushing medical history misinformation, claiming vaccines are harmful and useless, and that polio isn't even a real virus. She will probably get her own video at some point. Del Bigtree, full-time conspiracy broadcaster and general pile of human excrement, who is the CEO of anti-vax group ICANN, and who produced the garbage pseudo-documentary Vaxxed, based on Andrew Wakefield's bullshit. Speaking of whom, Andrew Wakefield is there too, the disgraced former doctor behind the fake MMR autism link, based on one fraudulent retracted study, which which required that he physically abuse children. A non-existent link that will never die, no matter how many times it's debunked. I've done that twice myself, and people still worship this worthless criminal. Peter McCullough, the one who pushes the spike protein detox supplements we talked about that made Steve Kirsch go blind in one eye, and who is behind the recent weaponization of predatory journals to try and bring fringe claims into the mainstream. His video is coming soon. Brett Weinstein, the pointless podcaster who pretends to be a scientific genius that I've debunked to smithereens in several videos, along with his idiot brother Eric, both of whom are on the Peter Thiel payroll. Let's not forget RFK's wife Cheryl, who is there for some reason. It's a star-studded affair. Pierre didn't get top billing, surprisingly, so he's down here without a picture. And even little Stevie Kirsch is in the fine print at the bottom. His set must be in the Sahara tent or something. Neither of these jerks are main stage material. Honestly, I'm shocked Joe Rogan isn't on here since he lives in Austin, and he would give them some great promo. Anyway, as you can see, Pierre has no interest in maintaining the company of legitimate doctors and scientists anymore. He's surrounded by podcasters and get-rich-quick conspiracy entrepreneurs, and this setting fits him like a glove. There's almost nothing too stupid for Pierre to amplify at this point, since his legitimate career is long behind him. He reposts dog-shit takes like this crap from Steve Kirsch, claiming that vaccines make you gay and trans. Surveys are awesome, right? I wonder if he saw my recent work exposing all the cases of vaccine-induced turbopenis, also via anonymous survey. Here's a post where he says Native Americans are saying the quiet part out loud, that COVID vaccines are biological weapons of mass destruction. And they would know best, right? They don't need medical knowledge. They're natural healing wizards with magic powers. Don't listen to every doctor in the world. Listen to Leaping Ram. And why not return to his idiotic claims that those kids who died of measles didn't really die of measles? Claims like this can be found on all the alt-health propaganda websites. Texas girl died from a hospital-acquired superbug, not measles. The hospital killed her, you guys. Measles isn't even real. In our debate, he went on a long rant where he pretended to have been officially tasked with finding the cause of death for these kids, though upon interrogation, he admitted that he just scoured for medical records and made up his own bullshit conclusion. He whined about antibiotics being stopped early in her second hospital stay, while simultaneously acknowledging that the pneumonia was antibiotic resistant, which would make the antibiotics useless and deliver nothing but unwanted side effects. He whined about several other particulars in protocol, who knows which aspects are even true, but the main point remains that pneumonia was contracted because of a weakened immune system due to measles infection, since measles infects memory B and T cells and destroys antibodies, including the ones that protect against bacterial pathogens. If she had gotten the MMR vaccine, she would not have gotten the measles, she wouldn't have had her immune system ravaged, she would never have been admitted to the hospital, so she would not have gotten pneumonia, and she would not have died. The child in question would still be alive if she had been vaccinated. And yet, the propaganda campaign against safe and effective vaccines rages on. What are the consequences? More measles outbreaks. There's one happening right now in Utah. Dozens of cases. Arizona too. Numerous hospitalizations, primarily children, all unvaccinated. No deaths yet, but if the MAGA minions get their way in Florida, plenty of deaths are coming. And if other states follow suit, we will have an enormous problem on our hands. Anybody who willingly allows children to die should be in jail for life, and one day there will be retribution for all these worthless piles of human filth. So that's what's left of Pierre Kory. Stripped of his credentials, he can't refer to himself as a doctor anymore, so he's been recast as a victim of big pharma censorship, and a hero in the conspiracy zeitgeist, a small group of vicious, persistent grifters that have infected millions of people with a mind virus that renders them incapable of seeing their heroes for the lying frauds they truly are. These are hypocrites like Pierre, a former ICU physician who knows precisely what these diseases can do, and why we need to prevent them from ever returning by rigorously vaccinating to achieve herd immunity. This is an infant with pertussis. This is what whooping cough looks like.
Okay. It's okay. Okay, take a breath in, honey. Come on. Almost there. There we go. Oh my. It's okay. It's
This is what Pierre wants to see more of. He wants thousands of children to die of preventable illnesses by fear-mongering about the entire vaccine schedule so that our ability to prevent them is eroded, only to then push treatments that don't do a fucking thing. About 160,000 children die of pertussis each year, though typically only 10 or so in the US because we have DTaP vaccines. But when people stop vaccinating their children, these diseases come back. Pierre knows the social cost of claiming that literally all vaccines are harmful, an insane generalization that he made emphatically right at the top of our debate. How is it that we're always fixating on the COVID vaccine and then all of these people here that are supporting you are just magically against all vaccines, right? If you're not anti-vaxxers, how did that happen exactly?
I'll help you out. It's all of them. Keep going.
Huh?
It's all of them. Keep going.
Okay, so he admits it.
Okay,
so you are just against all vaccines.
Yeah.
But he says it anyway because it suits his interests. Pierre overstates data or fabricates it, refuses to admit fault when exposed, and just monetizes the outrage. When all the double-blind randomized controlled trials prove him wrong and ivermectin's miraculous abilities evaporate into thin air, all that's left is the grift. Books, telehealth, sketchy podcast appearances, and pseudo-conference circuits that sell validation to the gullible people who were never interested in reality in the first place. Let's wrap things up by getting some commentary from a few professionals. First, let's talk to Gideon Meyerowitz-Katz. He's a senior research fellow in epidemiology at the University of Wollongong in Sydney, Australia, who has quite a bit to say about the COVID pandemic and ivermectin in particular. In fact, he has authored research regarding the efficacy of ivermectin, specifically examining the effects of medical fraud on how this data is reported. So his expertise will be quite welcome here.
Gideon, thanks so much for joining us. I'm pretty eager to get the benefit of some of your expertise here. I know that you have a number of publications addressing the efficacy of ivermectin against COVID, but also you've done a lot of work addressing retractions, corrections, fraudulent studies as they pertain to ivermectin. So I'd love to just turn it over to you to talk about all of that in whatever capacity you think would be useful.
Yeah, sure. I mean, so my main job is I'm an epidemiologist. I've been doing that for quite a long time now. My side gig, I like to call it, or one of the things that I do is look into, we call it unreliable research. Unreliable research is a broad term, and it kind of relates to studies that are made unreliable for a variety of reasons. And the reason we say unreliable is because someone like myself who's reading a study or looking at the data cannot necessarily say with any certainty what happened. You know, we're not following people with cameras, but we can say for sure that that study didn't happen as it was described, or there are significant errors that get in the way of us using that as evidence. I've personally been responsible for retracting somewhere in the region of 100 studies so far. And not all of those, or a substantial minority of those, were definitely not fraudulent, but in many cases, the authors didn't do what they said they did in the paper. Mm-hmm. So there was one case where I was involved in a study where it was very obvious that the randomization had completely failed, and the authors had described it as a randomized study. It had been published as a randomized study, but you could very easily tell from the baseline characteristics of both of the groups of these randomized groups that they were not randomly allocated. And the authors admitted very quickly when the journal put to them that, in fact, they hadn't randomized the groups, and so the journal decided to retract. The author said that was unfair at the time, but you know, this is how it goes.
Yeah.
So when I did a lot less than this actually before the pandemic, because I was very naive to the possibility that science could be faked or could be significantly problematic. I had a great deal of trust in the peer review system. But when the pandemic came around, I saw quite a lot of this. I was involved, if you've heard about Surgisphere.
Yes.
I was involved to some extent in the uncovering the fraud there. The Surgisphere was this company that claimed to have this huge database of hospital records and also claimed that hydroxychloroquine was killing people. Yeah, and they published several very big papers in the Lancet and the New England Journal of Medicine. And in one of the papers, they said they had data from Australia, and I'm Australian, and I looked at that data and I said, that's not possible. We don't have that many cases of COVID in hospital in Australia. so that they can't have that data. And I sent that to a journalist who then investigated the company, and that led to the whole scam falling apart.
So what was the
Anyway, so
motivation in that particular case?
Look, I think in most cases that I've come across, it's hard to know precisely what the authors are thinking, but the most likely motivation for people to do stuff like this is career advancement. Publishing a journal, any paper that you publish in the New England Journal of Medicine will basically guarantee a successful academic career. Having a paper in the New England Journal of Medicine and the Lancet and another one coming in the BMJ puts you at like the top tier of researchers in America.
And if it's a bombshell, a highly publicized, something that's very highly relevant to public health, that goes that way. Because it's interesting, obviously, fraudulent studies that would indicate efficacy of a particular drug, I understand the financial motivation there. But yeah, you're just saying, just generally, any any interesting research that will put you on a headline, there's a motivation there.
So an interesting point, and I think this is commonly misunderstood. I would say the vast majority of fraud currently is not for financial motivation, and certainly not in the pharmaceutical, in studies run by pharmaceutical companies. And the reason for that is not because pharmaceutical companies are good or because there's any lack of motivation. It's just because they're very, very highly regulated. If you have someone looking over your shoulder at your data and you have to give all of your information to an independent statistician who's not paid by your company, you cannot allow there to be any fraud, because the second there is even a suggestion that you've done anything incorrect, they'll audit your company and they'll find every mistake you've ever made, and that'll be terrible. So I think the FDA requiring pharmaceutical companies to provide them data really limited the amount of fraud that the industry got away with. Now that the FDA is being gutted, I wonder if it's going to start skyrocketing in the future.
Yeah.
Anyway, but the vast majority of misconduct that I have personally seen does not appear to have a straightforward financial motivation. Like, the researchers don't own a drug company producing this drug. Most of the time, it's people who've confected results simply, and it appears to be simply to get citations to build up an academic career.
So how would you characterize very early research regarding ivermectin that Pierre Kory was referencing? Obviously, we know now that there were no RCTs, but he was basing his rhetoric on something. Would you regard that research as misled or poorly done or specifically fraudulent, or what was retracted, what was corrected? Let's talk about sort of that early phase.
Sure. So this is a fascinating question. I have to say, I haven't spoken about ivermectin much in years. Hasn't really been an issue. And I understand it's becoming more of an issue in America because of the current administration. So it's very interesting to be asked about all this again.
Yeah.
The very earliest ivermectin fraud was Surgisphere. I referenced earlier. It was this fake company. They claimed to have hundreds or thousands of hospitals across the world, and they faked a paper that they published on the Lancet's preprint server, it's SSRN, Social Studies Research Network. It's now owned by the Lancet. It wasn't originally their preprint server. And they faked a paper saying that ivermectin worked incredibly well. That paper was based on some preclinical work done in Australia, showing that very, very high doses of ivermectin killed COVID-19. So the idea, and that paper, to be clear, that paper had a serious impact. There are news stories from mid 2020 talking about how when that paper on SSRN, when they deleted it from the server and it was retracted, there had already been governments, I think the government of Peru based their policy decisions on that paper by Surgisphere. So a lot of the follow-on came directly from this fraud. A lot of the reason why we are even talking about ivermectin, not all of it, because ivermectin was always a popular choice for people to sort of focus on. It's an incredibly safe drug, and it works really, really well for the thing that it works for, which is killing parasites. Yeah, it's an incredibly effective, incredibly safe drug that's literally all but eliminated several diseases from humanity. But And there was some preclinical work that showed that it might help with COVID, maybe. So there was always going to be some focus on ivermectin, but I think that the massive international concept, the fact that you've got these hundreds or millions of people looking into it, is because of that fraudulent Surgisphere paper that we know just completely fake. And then what happened was you got a series of these papers, mostly published on preprint servers, that appeared to then show, I would call them, I don't know the best word, monumental benefits for ivermectin. So when Pierre Kory, so I don't know what specific quote you're referencing there, but when Dr. Kory was talking to, I think it was the US Congress or someone in the US government in November 2020, and called it a perfect medicine. There's that quote that went viral online.
Yeah, miraculous.
Miraculous, right? He was specifically referring to a group of studies that had been published online, mostly on preprint servers at that point, as well as some of this sort of less robust evidence, such as the fraudulent Surgisphere study. I think there was also at that point there was a business consultant who'd done like an MBA, who had done what he called a multi-country analysis or something, and posted it online. And so I assume I don't know precisely what Pierre Kory was referring to in the moment, but I assume it was a collation of that sort of evidence.
Yeah, it's hard to imagine what percentage of that was specifically queuing up this ivermectin industry, right? As opposed to just sort of bad science, generally bad science. Perhaps we'll never know.
Personally, myself, I have always assumed good faith in people, because it's rare that people who promote medications, even people who own drug companies, it's rare that they think that they are solely in it for the money. Maybe, in the back of their mind. But you look at interviews with Pfizer's CEO, and Pfizer has, regardless of how fantastic the vaccine is and was, they have profiteered enormously from the pandemic and done some things that they should be ashamed of. And the CEO is passionate, very earnest, passionate, saying he's saving lives in every interview. And so I think most people see themselves as the heroes of their own stories, and that's the way we should probably assume they behave.
Well, and they did save lives, and then they maybe do other things that are bad. But I think that people at that level have an ability to appear earnest, maybe when they're not entirely. I don't know. I don't want to speculate on him in particular.
Anyway, yeah. So I don't think I'm not going to comment on the reasons for people's behavior. But so to go back to the research, right? What happened was I saw a bunch of this research popping up late 2020. I saw the viral meme, and I thought that seems a bit silly. These studies are bad. You can tell that they're bad just by a quick look. There was a study by a guy called Hector Carvalho in Argentina. At that point, wasn't looking into misconduct or any sort of unreliability. I just looked at the paper posted online, and it was a very obviously predatory journal, and the study didn't make sense. A lot of the writing in it was just bizarre, and I said no one who has ever done a scientific degree would believe that this is that this is worth basing their opinions on. And then we fast forward to June, July 2021. Ivermectin is going mega viral, or even May 2021, I think it might have been. And a master's student called Jack in the UK, he was doing his master's degree, and he looked at a study, one of the biggest study at that point, so 600-person RCT that had been posted on a preprint server called research. Oh no, I can't even remember the name of the preprint server now. I apologize, but it was a study by a man called Mohammed El-Ghazar and his team. And Jack noticed that the paper had a bunch of plagiarism in it, and it was fairly obvious plagiarism, particularly in the methods. That's really bad, because if you've plagiarized your methods, it calls into question whether you actually did the things that
Did
you say
anything.
you did in your
Yeah.
methods. And the plagiarism was not concealed. Basically, the entire introduction, the entire methods, large parts of the discussion had just been copied from previous pieces of research that were publicly available online. And so he sent, and then the next thing Jack did was he went to look at the data for the study, because it said the data is available online by request. And the data for this study was available on a link. If you go to this website, it was this super dodgy website. If you click to the link, there were a million ads, and it said, here's the data, you need a password to download this data. So you have to ask the lead researcher to get the data. But then underneath that was a button that said, if you pay $10 to our company, you can download the data even without the permission of the lead researcher. Not a great idea to do that if you're the researcher in question. So Jack did it, and he downloaded the data. The Excel spreadsheet was password protected, but the password was 1234. And so he also had access to data. And so he sent all this information to Nick Brown, who's probably the leading expert in scientific error detection and fraud analysis in the world. He also sent it to me. I don't know why he sent it to me, because I'm much less. I was certainly at that point much less experienced than Nick. Anyway, and asked us what we. Sorry.
But vocal online, so I think you can be traced to various Twitter threads and be.
Yeah, probably because of Twitter. Yeah. Anyway, he sent it to both of us, and we had a look. And I went and I downloaded the data sheet separately myself, as did Nick. You pay $10 and get the data yourself just to be thorough. And that data sheet was very clearly fake. We posted all the details publicly online at the time, but that specifically the data sheet, it had patients who died before the study started. It had multiple repeating patients. It had all sorts of characteristics that were not consistent with real patient data. And so, long story short, the study was retracted. It was definitely the most, I would say, the most obvious case of unreliability that I've worked on. Maybe not the most obvious, but one of the most obvious, because it had everything. It had plagiarism, it had impossibilities in the publication alone, and then it had a data spreadsheet which was very, very fake. Or rather, I shouldn't. Fake is a complicated word. I would say it was not consistent with a study done on real people, and certainly not consistent with the study that they reported having done. And that was the biggest study at the time. So 600 people, the only study above 200 people at the time, and it was complete nonsense. And you remove that one study. So at the time, Dr. Kory and a group of his colleagues had published a systematic review and meta-analysis looking at ivermectin. You remove that one study from the equation, and suddenly the picture dramatically changed. Instead of this huge benefit, you're looking at a much smaller benefit that was either not statistically significant or just barely statistically significant, depending on how you analyze the data. And that made a big difference. And because of this study, then myself, Nick Brown, James Heathers, and Kyle Sheldrick, who are another two people who work in the fraud and integrity space, and Jack, we all went and we looked at all of the ivermectin research that had been published to that point. And suffice to say, it was riddled with similar studies. Few that were as obvious, but riddled with similarly problematic research.
Yeah. It makes you wonder how this research came to be in the first place. Those that stand to profit from selling ivermectin possibly could have been involved in, making this happen, having something to point to, and that's
Again, I don't think so. Personally, my personal
Really?
opinion is that the people who are currently benefiting from ivermectin, there were a couple of examples where you could argue that there was some financial conflict of interest. There's a company called MedinCell that during COVID, they had a proprietary ivermectin formula. They had a long-acting injectable form of ivermectin that they were trying to sell. And they did a study that they claimed showed massive benefits. that's an odd story because they published that, or they never published the study. The only information on the study was a poster that they put online in 2023 after ivermectin had stopped being a concern, and they've never fully published the results, and they no longer sell that product. So who knows what happened to Medincell?
Sure.
But broadly speaking, I don't think anyone who's currently profiting off the ivermectin stuff in any way was motivated. And most of the people who ran these studies back in 2020 and 2021 had no financial conflict of interest whatsoever.
No, I believe that, certainly. But then you get to a point where claims are made. Let's talk about Pierre in particular, because this video that this interview is going in is about Pierre. But he's had the benefit of almost 4 years now to reflect on all of this. All of this information is very available. The work that you've done, that a number of other researchers have done to demonstrate the fraudulence of all these studies, the studies that he himself propped up in order to substantiate his claims about ivermectin as this miracle drug and everything. Why the inability to admit fault? Why the inability to go, you know what, we jumped the gun and I got a little over exuberant and and just in the context of how much he has truly profited off of selling ivermectin, not through bureaucratic means, but just on the internet, as a thing on the side, an informal marketplace. What is your impression of Pierre, the guy he is, the statements he's made about ivermectin, about saying all vaccines are bad, literally all of them? He said that in debate against him. That was the first thing he said. What do you think of Pierre?
Honestly, I have no strong opinions about Pierre Kory. He has said some very nasty things about me online. I think he's regularly claimed that I'm funded entirely by the pharmaceutical industry, which is not true. I've never received any pharmaceutical funding in my career. In fact, of the 5 people who worked on those studies, I don't believe any of us have ever received any pharmaceutical industry funding because it would bias our work.
It's sort of a cop out, right? That's just a way of getting people to reject anything you say without taking the responsibility of actually addressing what you're saying, right? You've shown you've told me very specific things about how these studies are fraudulent, right?
Or unreliable. Not all of them are fraudulent.
Sure,
Sorry,
unreliable. Yeah, done poorly or with ill intent, one or the other. But it's a way to just paint with a broad brush and say, disregard these people, disregard them. Pharma bad. This is Pharma man, so he's a bad man. Without looking at the data sets, and you've said very specific things about how the data is fraudulent in that one particular case. So you cannot really conclude anything other than you cannot conclude anything other than bad faith from a character like that. So
look, I mean, as I said, I have no strong opinions, or I haven't thought about Pierre since I last watched. Someone sent me a snippet of a video in which he implied that I was being paid by the pharmaceutical industry. I think that was in 2022. Since then, I genuinely have not once thought about the man. I haven't really, as I said when we started talking, I haven't really thought about ivermectin in years. It's a fantastically effective drug for a small number of diseases and doesn't really work for anything else. And I also think it's useful to understand that none of this requires that people, none of these problems require that people are acting in bad faith. So I even regardless of what you think about Pierre, I would say there are absolutely people who believe that ivermectin works who are 100% good faith actors, and they have just been conned essentially by tricksters and frauds. Because if you approach all of these studies with a sort of firm belief that no one would ever try to trick you, then you are very easy to fool. And also deep misunderstanding of how scientific research should work.
Sure.
I think,
Yeah.
if you have, I don't mean to be mean to non-medical researchers, but let's say you had a very intelligent physicist who went after this problem in a good faith manner, they might conclude that ivermectin works because they're not familiar with medical research.
Hmm. Yeah, of course. Yeah, a different field. But yeah, I guess we're uncovering sort of the difference in the sphere of focus of a researcher, an epidemiologist versus a science communicator. I think about people like Pierre every day. So I sometimes envy you can sort of just go, well, this guy doesn't matter. He,
I just don't talk about people's intentions. I'm not
sure,
here to litigate anyone's intentions. That
sure.
because I think people do things for many different reasons, and sometimes those are monetary, but sometimes they're not.
Well, I'm here to elucidate intention, so I'll do that on behalf of you. You don't have to do it. You don't have to impose yourself. So let's pivot. Just, I have one more question because you are an epidemiologist. You live in Australia. I was curious as to any thoughts you had regarding the differences between Australia and America in terms of COVID response, vaccine hesitancy, discrepancy in the types of mandates that were implemented. Just a broad impression of pandemic, Australia versus America. What do you think?
Um. Yes, just an easy, quick 3 or 4 hour response.
Yeah,
Is that what you're
just a
looking for?
soundbite if you can. Yeah.
I think um, you know, Australia and America are very different countries. And to answer that question, I think it's important to talk about countries being different. And I think, broadly speaking, the thing that people often miss when they discuss what we should have done when COVID came is that what we should have done was highly locally specific. And so you can't easily compare different countries. So like Australia, right? We've got 9 states and territories. America has 50 states and a wide number of territories. We had a very cohesive response because there were only 9 people in the room when they were having those discussions. You have, or 10 people, the prime minister and then the heads of state,
Mhm.
heads of each state. And in Australia, the heads of the state it's a much more powerful position, at least within that state, because in America you have a governor, you have a state legislature, which often includes two houses, and so there's a very wide pyramid of people you have to sort of work with when you're trying to implement things from state to state. In Australia, you've got a state premier who basically governs most of those decisions. So I think Australia had a not uniquely, but globally very unusually cohesive response because we were one of the biggest countries that was not an authoritarian state that managed to have such a cohesive and consistent response over the 2 years. And I personally think that if you look globally, the biggest thing that led to pandemic success at a national level was not the specific policies that individual countries went after. It was how cohesive and how consistent their responses were. And yes, I mean, so Sweden, the classic discussion is Sweden versus their closest neighbors. Did Sweden do better or worse than Norway and Denmark? And I think if you look at the responses from Sweden and the responses from Norway, Denmark, Iceland, Finland, they were more similar than they were different.
Mhm.
And that's probably because culturally those countries are almost identical. They have a great deal of similarity. People talk about how Sweden never did lockdowns, Denmark did lockdowns. Denmark's lockdowns were very different to the lockdowns in America and the UK and Spain. And I would, when I was talking to my friend who lives in Denmark in 2021, I would hazard a guess that no people living in the UK would not recognize sort of life in Denmark as pandemic life at the time. So,
But Sweden
look,
had a second wave, and they did implement some kind of mandates because, yeah, the second wave was worse than.
again, it's also complicated because when Sweden's response, Sweden has a very, very high trust in government, so many of their measures, when they recommendations from the government, were adopted more widely than United States mandates,
Correct.
right?
Yeah.
And the same with Japan. So actually, Japan is a wonderful example. In Japan, they never implemented a mask mandate.
Yeah.
It,
Americans
it
are
has
like
ne
insolent preteens. They'll just like do the opposite of what the government tells them to do.
America, Brazil, lots of countries have a deep mistrust of the government. But
Yeah.
so Japan, right? They never told their citizens, they never fined anyone for not wearing a mask. No one was ever put in prison for not wearing a mask, and yet they had close to 100% mask compliance. I went there at the beginning of 2023, and mask wearing was still nearly ubiquitous in every public setting. And the reason for that is because if you didn't wear a mask, every single person on the street would look at you like you were
Yeah.
insane. And you would get old women like swearing at you and crossing the street to
Yeah.
avoid you.
Well,
So it's like
Asia
a
had
cultural
always
thing.
had a lot of mask wearing for quite some time because there was another what was the other pandemic, the first
SARS 1 was
SARS
the,
one,
yeah.
and other, they just generally have been more aware of communicable diseases, I think, over there. So it wasn't as weird. Americans were not used to wearing masks.
I think that's part of it, but I also just think it was a cultural difference in that if the government in Japan says people should probably wear masks, every single person in the country puts
Take it
on a
to heart.
mask.
That's right.
If the government if the CDC posts online that Americans should wear masks, a third of the country will burn masks in their front yard
Yeah.
just to show that they're not obeying what the government
Which
says.
is like insane, because it's like I understand that the American government is awful, and I understand that we have this our foreign policy and we do horrible, horrible things, but it has nothing to do with, hey, maybe cover up your face where the viruses come out of, and go to, you know what I mean? Like, it's just, I don't know. It's people are unable to like compartmentalize aspects of government, which is frustrating.
Yeah, and I think there's also something that happened in America, which has happened to an extent in most of the places in the world, but was much, much bigger in the United States, was the politicization of
Yeah.
science. There is no other country that I'm aware of in the world where vaccine hesitancy is almost entirely predicated on political party.
Yes.
In Australia, the right-wing group is slightly more vaccine hesitant than the left-wing group, but both of the major parties are 100% on the same page, aside from, the occasional weirdo about vaccines.
Yeah, America is unique. Trying my best to help depoliticize science. Yeah, that's about all I wanted to talk about. I guess just to close, is there anything in particular that you wish the general public understood about epidemiology, or what epidemiologists do in particular? Anything like that?
Honestly, not really. Most of my job is boring.
Yeah,
I call myself a doctor of spreadsheets because most of the time I'm doing some sort of statistical analysis.
sure.
I guess when it comes to ivermectin, one thing I did wish the general public understood is that ivermectin is a fantastic medication.
Hmm.
And if your doctor prescribes you ivermectin, if it's for the right indication, you should probably take it. There is still,
Sure.
I think it was very unfortunate that the sort of backlash against the ivermectin turned into its own form of pseudoscience.
Sure. Yeah.
There are still people, when I post about ivermectin online today, there are still people who
Oh, it's
ask me why I'm
horse-based.
talking. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
But actually, it almost eliminated river blindness from the world,
Right.
which was a
It won a
horrifying
Nobel.
disease.
Yeah.
Yeah,
There's nothing
for
wrong
good
with the drug
reason.
when used as
Yeah.
indicated, for parasites. Yeah, of
And it
course.
is genuinely one of the safest drugs that we've ever come across.
Mhm.
We in 2009 to 2015, the World Health Organization had this amazing program where they gave hundreds, I think over 1 billion doses of the drug to over 1 billion people, not doses. So over 1 billion people got doses of the drug to treat river blindness, and it almost eliminated this horrible disease from the world. It still happens because there's an animal reservoir, but
Sure.
amazing thing, yeah, and enormously safe. Very, very few adverse events. But if you give it in the correct dosage, if you
Yeah,
take
that's the
massive
problem.
doses, yeah,
People
not so great.
people took veterinary doses, and there were a handful of deaths, from ivermectin overdose. So,
but that's the fault of disinformation and people using it not in inappropriate ways. That's the danger of somebody like Pierre Kory or Simone Gold or these other figures that take things out of the traditional healthcare system and just start selling things online, or encouraging people to go to where people get ivermectin for livestock and take that and then consume that or apply that topically or whatever. It's just crazy. It's just absolutely
I
insane.
mean, honestly, ivermectin is so safe that if unless you take entire tubes of livestock medication, you're still probably not going to be at the sort of dangerous level. The people who've died from overdoses are taking truly like an entire
Yes,
tube of horse medication a day.
sure.
That will kill you. But if you take a tube of horse medication over 3 weeks, you will probably have some vision issues because it does cause
Hmm.
visual processing problems. But it's very unlikely that that would cause
Yeah,
severe, long-lasting health problems because it's so safe.
yeah.
But yes,
Well, it's a
if you
shame that we had to find out what that did to anybody in the first place because humans should not have been using it. So, yeah.
yeah, you shouldn't use. It's ideally you should only use doses for specific parasitic diseases, and you should use the doses prescribed that are
Yeah.
indicated, which is a very low dose
Yeah.
compared to
And
what some people are recommending for COVID.
yeah. And now that the pandemic is over, they're pivoting and saying it treats cancer, it treats this, it treats that. The grift goes on. So, yeah.
I haven't looked in any detail at the cancer claims, but I have looked at some of the preclinical work, and it's very unimpressive.
Yeah.
And there have been no RCTs that I am aware of looking at the cancer. So I would say currently it's very unlikely that ivermectin works for cancer, but we don't have sufficient data to make a
Hmm.
definitive conclusion.
Well, maybe we'll circle back for a part two.
One
But
day.
yeah. Anyway,
I haven't
thanks
seen
very
any
much.
fraud, so that's a bit different to COVID.
Oh, yeah. This was very elucidating. Yeah, thanks very much for your time and your insight.
Thanks, Gideon. Now let's talk to Greg Tucker Kellogg, professor of biology at the National University of Singapore. He's done some work exposing bogus publications regarding ivermectin as well. Let's get the full story.
Greg, thanks so much for joining us. Eager to talk to you here about your perspective with regards to Pierre and some other topics. Just to start, you've worked in industry, you've worked in academia, so you have a lot of perspective here on how research is conducted. What do you make of Pierre's narrative, the way he presents himself as this persecuted, truth-telling medical warrior? Does it hold any water? What's your perspective here?
Well, so if so, he's yeah, he has this perspective of this sort of persecuted, this sort of righteous person who's a bit contrarian, and he's had that for a while. He had that before COVID, and I think COVID was, I suspect, something of an opportunity to kind of lean into that role. So he had it before with his mentor, Paul Merrick, on some protocols related to treatment of sepsis, acute treatment of sepsis. And then he really, really leaned into it with COVID. It just fit, I think, who he wanted to be, what the kind of public figure that he wanted to represent.
Hmm. Yeah, I like that you call it an opportunity. I see it that way as well. What do you make of his rhetoric in terms of like I think that many people would maybe give him a pass on possibly presenting ivermectin as a possible treatment for COVID, maybe not the emphatic manner in which he overstated the potential. But since then, since December 2020, all of the research that's rolled in, have you stayed on top of his
Oh
rhetoric?
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Tell us
So
about
I
that.
yeah, so you have to go back right to early 2020 when the first paper was an in vitro paper on ivermectin came out from Kylie Wagstaff's
Right.
group in Australia. And that was an in vitro paper. And people were excited about it. There was a lot of work on trying to identify repurposed drugs. And there was interest in a lot of these. They were pursued quite seriously. So people took them seriously. In that sense, he wasn't alone in taking them seriously early on. However, uh, once the evidence started coming in, the evidence was uh, both the empirical evidence just in the efficacy and so on, and in better in vitro studies didn't hold up. The clinical evidence, when it came in, eventually didn't hold up. And none of that stopped Kory. So Kory got on this bandwagon very, very early, started referring to ivermectin as a miracle drug very, very early. And he just really stuck with it. It became, just part of his message of who he was. And it was actually how I wound up getting dragged into this whole thing in the first place, because somebody I knew was listening to him. So somebody I knew here in Singapore uh, had reached out to me, somebody without a scientific background or medical background had reached out to me to ask me if I could help them understand this drug. And they were also concerned about vaccines. And this was in late 2020. They asked me to help them understand this. They said, there's this guy, Pierre Kory, who's been talking about this. He'd just given his testimony, and there were some groups, online groups, Telegram groups, things like that, that were talking about this, and they were very worried about vaccines. And she asked me to help her understand what that situation was. And I'd known this person for a long time, and we ended up having a conversation, and I ended up going kind of more deeply into all of that rhetoric. We had a conversation for this was, I guess, November of 2020. And we had that conversation for about 9 months. And eventually, in late 2021, she decided to go ahead and get a vaccine. And then at that point, she and her husband invited me over for dinner. And I said, I was great. I'd never met her husband before, and I wasn't sure where he was on this at all. And I went over to their house. He met me at the door. I wasn't sure what to expect. And he said, I want to thank you for, like getting my wife back to reality and, possibly saving our marriage. And it was really meaningful to me, but it was also, it was really frustrating because it was Kory's rhetoric was really responsible for this rabbit hole that a well-meaning person had gone down, right?
It's interesting that she wouldn't listen to her spouse. I don't know what the educational background is of her spouse, but
She wanted somebody with a scientific
sure, that
background,
makes
right?
sense.
Somebody who
But
could really talk about those things.
yeah, these people like Pierre are persuasive, so I don't fault people for falling for it because he does have a medical background and he does, come off very confident. But good on her for listening to you and listening to you for an extended period of time, then eventually making the right decision. If only we could say the same for everybody, especially Americans. I don't think we'd be in quite the situation that we're in terms of this administration and Bobby Kennedy and everything that's just going down the toilet now. But speaking of the pandemic in general, I mean, so for my viewers, you're in Singapore. You've been there for quite a long time. So you were in
Yep.
Singapore for the pandemic. What was that like over there? What are not that you were living in America, but I'm sure on the news you could get a sense of what it was like here. Can you contrast those and comment about it?
Sure. Well, Singapore is a small country. It's a city state, right? And it's extremely efficiently run. And they did a fantastic job. They were very clear and specific about what they called tracing and tracking early on, about contact tracing. Of course, they had restrictions. They had non-pharmaceutical interventions. They did have a lockdown that began in April. But they did an incredible job of managing all of the aspects of the pandemic and public understanding of the pandemic, education, the kinds of changes that people needed to make in lifestyle and so on. They handled all of that really well before the vaccines were available, and then when the vaccines were available, they did just a bang up job. I couldn't ask for anything better in terms of managing the vaccine rollout. So to this day, I can look on my phone and get the schedule. Like, when did I get my vaccines? Where did I get them? It has down to the lot number. I can get that information. And it was done nationwide. they were rolled out by age groups, and free, and just fantastic job.
Mhm.
Absolutely fantastic job.
Is there some anti-vaccine rhetoric in Singapore
Yes.
or in Asia in general? Just not a lot
Yes.
of it, or what does that look
Yeah.
like?
Yeah. So there's quite a bit uh, in neighboring countries. So there's quite a bit in there is quite a bit in Singapore. There was a group in Singapore, the anti-vax group. That was what my friend, where she heard the rhetoric.
Hmm.
Um, there was a trial recently uh, of some people involved in uh, basically I mean, I don't want to go so much into the details in the sort of Singapore legal context, but basically somebody who was uh, involved in some folks who were involved in um, uh, kind of getting people to take to appear to have taken the vaccines, basically without actually having
Hmm.
taken the vaccines.
Hmm. Okay.
Um, uh, and that came out. There's also quite a bit in neighboring countries. So one of the larger trials of ivermectin was done in Malaysia. And that trial of ivermectin was done in part in response to some of the anti-vaccine, um, the communities in Malaysia that were anti-vaccine. And, the anti-vaccine and pro-ivermectin folks are pretty much joined at the hip.
Hmm.
And this was a trial that was put together by concerned physicians and researchers in Malaysia. And they ran a really nice trial. And like all of the other good trials on ivermectin, didn't show a benefit, a clinical benefit. So,
And did anyone find that persuasive, or were they ready with pharma shills are lying excuses?
so of course they were ready with the same pharma shills are lying, but this one, it wasn't a pharma sponsored trial at all. It
Oh,
was
that doesn't stop them from making that accusation, right? Pharma
right,
bought the results.
right,
Yeah.
yeah. Of course, the people who are convinced about the ivermectin story are not going to they're not going to change their view, because it's really, it's such a, they've become so passionate about it. It's beyond really any form of reason.
Yeah.
And I don't mean that as, it's just the rhetoric is so strong. Um, the reason is almost beside the point, at
Mhm.
that point, you know.
Yeah, there's a market hypocrisy to it too, because with ivermectin in particular, I find it hilarious that it's almost certainly the case that more people died of ivermectin overdose than of COVID vaccines. There's only about 10 confirmed vaccine deaths, and a few dozen, I think, of ivermectin. But there's no outrage there, right? They don't want to talk about that or acknowledge that.
Yeah.
So
I, I think there's another irony here, which is the idea that ivermectin in particular has been is represents this great opportunity, and but they can't make money on it. But Merck, which developed ivermectin,
yeah,
has never really made money
no,
on it for
they give it
humans
away.
because
Yeah.
they've just given it away,
Yeah.
and they've always given it away. They even did the clinical trials knowing that they were going to give it away.
Right. And I mean, not that they're like what it makes the stock go up or what what it's not like they're just it's pure charity, but like it's true. It was never a moneymaker, and I don't know, but I had to say this in the debate to Pierre's face as well, just that the whole narrative falls apart completely because there were other generic drugs that were repurposed to treat COVID, and as you said right when we started the conversation, that people were looking for this stuff. Right? Everyone was actively looking for a cheap generic to repurpose. So
Yeah, in Kory's one of Kory's hearings before, I guess, Senate Homeland Security, Ron Johnson's group.
mhm.
In one of his hearings, maybe more than one, he would complain about this. He said, "Oh, nobody's looking for these repurposed drugs and so on."
Yeah,
The NIH had a very systematic screening program looking for repurposed drugs for COVID. They were
yeah,
basically putting multiple drugs through systematic screens, looking for antiviral activity,
right.
looking for, so the idea that this wasn't happening is just it's just fantasy.
Yeah, and that he didn't, this is how we know he was a fraud from day one with the ivermectin thing because he's a physician. He is in this world. He knew that. He absolutely knew that that research was being done. A Joe Schmo on the street might not know, but Pierre did, and he said that. And when he misrepresents the medical and scientific community that way, that's a gigantic problem. I mean, speaking of the, I mean, it's just now in this post-truth era, particularly the post-COVID era, this is such a proven business model. Have any kind of pedigree whatsoever, use that, leverage that to then go on the internet, go on the podcast circuit, say, I'm being censored, my truth is too hot to handle, I'm this whistleblower, whatever it is, and then rake in the cash via, whether it's AdSense revenue, John Campbell or something like that, podcasting, Brett Weinstein, there's just dozens or even hundreds of these guys. Now, where this is obviously the $1 million question, and this is the business that I trade in, but what do you have any perspective on what we can say to people who have been ensnared by these types of figures, this type of rhetoric, the charisma, the story of the underdog versus the big evil pharma, whatever it is? How can we snap them out of it? How did you snap your friend out of it? I know it took 9 months, but if you
okay, so the 9 months is important, right? I mean, you're familiar with Brandolini's law, right?
Of
The
course,
bullshit asymmetry
yeah.
principle. And it really struck me in this experience with my friend just how much work it is, because that business, that grifting business, which is always very much about stories. There are these villains that they're not realistic, right? They're very much kind of James Bond style villains.
Yeah, it's literally Dr. Evil stroking a cat, and
right.
I am all of
Right.
pharma.
Yeah,
it's
they're just so cartoonish, but they're necessary for this kind of thing, and it takes so much work. So you have to, I mean, it has to be countered. It has to be countered by like your effort, right? So countered by folks who take it seriously and are willing to put in the considerable work to do it. In fact, I will say, after I went to that dinner with my friend and her husband, I came home, and then I think it was the next day, John Campbell had put up a video about ivermectin. He made this video claiming that ivermectin worked using the same mechanism of action as what is now Pfizer's drug, Paxlovid, but at the time it had a code name PF, one of their compounds. It didn't have a commercial name. And I was so mad about this. I was so furious because I saw that video, and this is now, kind of right in my wheelhouse. I had been paying attention to this Pfizer agent, which is a brilliantly designed drug, I will say, the way Pfizer did this. And they learned a lot from designing drugs for SARS-1. And then they improved the design with what became Paxlovid in a number of very clever ways. So there's a lot of things about the drug design of that thing that are really impressive, kind of beautiful science. And I had been following this story, and the mechanisms proposed for ivermectin as in COVID in the first place don't really make much sense. But then Campbell has this long thing where it's even more conspiratorial, because he's now got, it's just basically this new drug is just Pfizer's way of selling ivermectin at 1,000,000 times the price or whatever.
Right.
And I was really mad. And I don't think I'd ever made a YouTube short before. I had a little YouTube channel where I just put on occasional like educational videos that related to the things that I was teaching. But I was pissed off, and I got out my phone and I just ranted into my phone, and I was like, what the hell is this bullshit? I wonder if I should make a response video. And I just did that. This was just venting, right?
Yeah.
And then I uploaded the video, and then I don't know, went away, went to lunch, and I came back, and it had thousands and thousands of views, and people were commenting and like, yeah, put up or shut up, you better, all this kind of stuff. And so my
Wait,
first video,
antagonizing you or supporting you?
yeah, antagonizing me,
Antagonizing,
basically saying, "Who am I to go up against the great John Campbell?"
yeah. Yeah, the
And
great nurse John Campbell.
it was because of these responses uh, and people kind of challenging me to put up or shut up or do a video in response, which I had, I don't know, suggested off the cuff. That was what led to my first video, my first entry into this whole misinformation
Yeah.
world. Um, and I realized, I did videos for a couple of years and then I've stopped. I've been doing some other things, doing my job back, more research and so on. But it's it is so much work.
Yes.
And it needs people who are working scientists, also doing real science communication, uh, to challenge this, because otherwise it's just filled with grifters.
It's great. I do think that different tiers of SciComm are necessary. I appreciate when researchers such as yourself do some SciComm because it obviously has a lot of rigor because you have expertise and it sort of makes some of that information more accessible to someone like me who's a generalist who can then take that information from sources of yours and other researchers and just as many references as I can get, and then package it together in a way that's more accessible to the layperson
Yeah,
and just like disseminate that information even further. It's sort of a tiered approach to SciComm. I do this full time. Researchers can do it part time and be part of that pipeline. Just we all kind of need a synergy here, and I think we're starting to figure that out right around now
yeah,
post COVID. That this is what
I
has to
do think
happen.
it's very much tiered, and it needs all of those tiers because it is a lot of work, right? If there are folks like you who are really committing to it, it makes it possible for folks like me to put out an occasional video that's, um, that contributes to this,
Yes.
um,
Yeah.
but is, it doesn't cede all the ground, all the communication ground
Right.
to, to this really malevolent, uh,
Machine of
yeah,
disinformation. Yeah, we need to up the volume. I'm trying to do my best to kind of crank out content as quickly as I can. But yeah, absolutely. There's just so much out there and so many people just because of how profitable it is. But yeah, that's all I wanted to ask. Definitely thank you for your perspective here. Is there anything
my pleasure,
else
Dave.
you can think of, or yeah, just
No, I hope we'll hear less of this particular story, but there's always, this is uh, a whack-a-mole world, if ever
it
there
is
was one, right?
very
So there's
much.
going to be more of this.
Yeah,
Um,
and from other figures and other drugs and other things, but even ivermectin itself, because now that the pandemic has died down, guess what? Ivermectin cures cancer now too,
right,
and this
that's
other
right.
thing, and this fourth thing, and this tenth thing. It's absolutely
Yeah.
insane to me. If people don't learn their lesson, but we'll be here. We're working on it. So thanks very much.
Thanks, Greg. Finally, let's chat with an individual named Peter who wishes to remain relatively anonymous. This is a professional who was on the front lines during the pandemic, and they have a lot to say about their experience.
Peter, thanks so much for joining us. I'm very excited to speak to somebody with some experience in terms of dealing with the pandemic in a healthcare setting. Please go ahead and tell us just generally what your experience was as a healthcare worker during the pandemic, what you were up to, and whatever you'd like to start with.
So my experience as a healthcare worker during the pandemic, started out, I was working actually as a cardiac monitor technician. There's a few different pseudonyms for that, but essentially my role was monitoring 50 patients on continuous electrocardiograms. And I would be the one who would notify nurses when things were going wrong and they needed to check on a patient. So I was kind of like the lifeline almost, I guess would be a good way to put it. During the pandemic as well, I was going to nursing school, and over time, I had kind of developed during the pandemic an understanding of a lot of stuff going on. Now I'm currently a nurse and I work in specifically a cardiac unit. And so I feel I'm pretty well qualified to talk about cardiac stuff as well as kind of an overview of the pandemic. And certainly while I wasn't necessarily the first in line, there were a lot of emergencies I responded to during the pandemic. Whenever anything went wrong, I was occasionally you had to step up to get into a room to save somebody when nobody else was there.
Let's talk about kind of thick of the meat of the pandemic, the most stressful times there where there were the most deaths per day. What was the treatment protocol like? How was that changing on a day-to-day basis? What did it look like in terms of people who were dying of COVID? Yeah, give us a sense of what it was like.
So my level of care was telemetry. There's four levels of care in the hospital. There's med surge and telemetry, and then there's intermediate care and intensive care. So just briefly to cover that. But over time, the pandemic, let's see, March of 2020, we shut down. Obviously, as a country, we had probably that 1 week, whatever it was, shut down. Um, and in my area in particular, it started off slow. I know in New York, things kind of hit the ground running. But I would say very much at the beginning of the pandemic, we were sort of flying blind in terms of what our treatment protocols were. A lot of it was aimed at kind of just, well, COVID kills via hypoxia, so oxygen, prophylactic antibiotics. Slowly over the course of the pandemic, that shifted. Things slowly kind of picked up where I was. I'd say some of the worst periods of time were during kind of that holiday season of 2020 all the way to February of 2021. In my area, it got really bad. During that Delta wave we had, I believe it was around August or September of 2021. Things got really ugly. There for sure were a lot of times that we had patients die. As somebody who had to, I had to watch all these hearts on the monitor, and then oftentimes the staffing resources we had were short. So we've had stuff like safety sitters before, where it's one person who's dedicated to going into just dealing with this one patient because maybe they're confused, maybe they need a little more extra care. But we were short even on those staff, so we kind of went to where they would hand me like an audio video baby monitor and say, here, watch this person. So I'd be watching up to three of those along with maybe 30, 40 hearts at a time, and responding to alarms, making phone calls. So you kind of could get a sense of what it was like for these patients. A lot of them were alone. There were certainly people, one of the signs of hypoxia, as people get low on oxygen, they become confused. So you'd see people who would get really confused and they'd rip off their oxygen, and we'd have them on my floor, at least, we'd have them maxed out on oxygen externally. We didn't intubate on my floor, but we'd have them maxed out on what we could do externally to supplement oxygen. And these people would rip off their oxygen and, oh, they'd be blue within seconds. I recall there were definitely times where, by the time you get into the room, patients passed out in the bed and you'd have to put the oxygen back on, wait there about 5-10 minutes, probably five, but 5 minutes, and you'd have to wait for them to come to again, and you'd repeat this over and over again all night for 12 hours. In some ways, the way I view it is almost like if you put a plastic bag over somebody's head and wait till they pass out, and then they take it off and wait for them to come to. I'd say it was practically torture at times for some of these patients.
And that probably had quite a traumatic impact on thousands and thousands of health workers, I'm sure.
Um, yes, it definitely did. I'm a bit ashamed because my role wasn't nurse at the time, but I mean, I definitely still struggle with PTSD. I have faces that are blurred, sounds that I've heard, people's last words, which I'm not going to go into all of those. But I've definitely had my fair share of, moments that I'm still trying to work through. And so I do actually want to thank you for the opportunity because to talk to you here today, because it in some ways is a little cathartic to be able to share this with the public, because I don't think a lot of people know what we went through during that time.
Hmm. What about, so to bring it to this topic of the video here, all of these alternate therapies, ivermectin, hydroxychloroquine, etc. Do you have any experience with patients bringing that up, wanting to be treated that way because they heard on the internet that that's what needs to happen? People requesting vaccines, but it's too late. All of this kind of stuff. What can you say about that?
Well, so a lot of the emergencies I'd respond to were somebody has to cover my monitors real quick because I have to go run a 12 lead EKG on somebody because an emergency happened. And you get to talking to some of these people. For sure, I can't necessarily speak to ivermectin because it really kind of didn't pick up until people like Joe Rogan kind of brought it to the mainstream. It was a little bit in the background there, but I would say it didn't pick up national consciousness in terms of everyone knowing what ivermectin was until a bit later in the pandemic. What I can say is Pierre Kory, for example, who we're talking about, obviously,
Hmm.
at the time when he was making that, I believe he made the miracle drug claim about December of 2020, if I'm not
That's
mistaken.
right. Yes.
And that was probably an all hands on deck. It was a disaster, hospital to hospital across the country. And some of what he had said, I'm probably getting a bit ahead of myself, but some of what he had said probably got some people, I'm sure, to feel more comfortable. Oh, if I take this drug, I can't spread it. I can't do it. I can't
Hmm.
get sick. Um, I definitely heard of quite a few patients who had requested the vaccine, and you know, at that point, it's too late. We kind of give vaccines as prevention, not as a treatment.
Yeah.
Um,
You're already infected, my friend.
yeah. Um, I mean, and regarding other medications, so there's stuff like hydroxychloroquine, which to defend hydroxychloroquine just a bit, and I'm not going to defend it hard. It did have a sound hypothesis, and it was investigated, including in my hospital. I believe my hospital, in particular, had probably given it as a trial for about a month, maybe a month and a half. I can't quite recall. We had a very robust education program in my hospital where throughout the pandemic, at least once a month, our head of medicine and infectious disease would update us on what they're trying, what's working, what's not working. And we did try hydroxychloroquine. It's a drug that's given for lupus. And a lot of what was killing patients was the autoimmune response to COVID. So there were, you know, COVID killed via hypoxia, but there were two mechanisms for which it would cause hypoxia. The first being it's causes a bilateral pneumonia. Um, and so that impairs gas exchange. But the other insidious way that it killed, at least in the early variants up through Delta, there was this concept of a cytokine storm.
I was going to say that, yeah, cytokine storm.
And so what we'd see often with these patients is they'd have this pneumonia that we're working them through. And we'd get maybe about 10 days into their illness, and they'd have a day where they got better. Their oxygen demands were going down. They were feeling a little bit better. And then the next day they would just tank as this autoimmune process effectively destroyed their lungs. Um, and so hydroxychloroquine was worthy of investigation at the time. I guess where I find ivermectin interesting is that there's no proposed hypothesis for why it would work in
Right.
any way for viruses.
Why would an anti-parasitic, mechanistically speaking, how does that work? Of course, yeah.
And I looked a little bit into it just briefly today before I got on here with you. I mean, I suppose there's been a few studies that are in vitro, but an in vitro study is about as useful as me saying, well,
Right.
fire kills COVID.
Yeah, and it was
Um,
only one in vitro, and it was a dosage that an insane dosage that would kill a person. So, and in fact, people did overdose on on ivermectin. So,
quite a few.
mhm. But I like what you're saying because this is the thing is that what these frauds want to sell as a narrative is the healthcare professionals as these closed-minded people that don't want to try anything. It's the complete opposite. I mean, the chaos and the panic that was occurring in 2020 as people tried to search for some kind of protocol. They tried everything. You guys tried hydroxychloroquine. You tried it rigorously. People did RCTs on ivermectin, even though there was no reason to really think from a theoretical standpoint why that would work. They did the studies anyway. Right? Like professionals are trying everything and then ruling out things that don't work. So that's one thing that I wish people would understand. Um, yeah, well, being that your expertise is cardiac stuff, let's also really quick touch on these claims about COVID vaccines causing these extreme cardiac events, and then compare that to the same issues as a result of COVID infection.
Well, so I work on a heart unit. Our bread and butter is heart attacks, heart failure, and that includes other things such as these proposed complications of the vaccine of pericarditis, myocarditis, which is a fancy way of saying inflammation of the heart. Now, what I've obviously anecdotes aren't data, but anecdotally, I could say from experience, I've seen probably, I'd say 3 to 5 cases of myocarditis, endocarditis, just in my area of in people that I've dealt with. I've seen maybe 3 to 5 cases where it was induced by the COVID virus itself. Um, Now, what I haven't seen yet is I haven't seen a single person who's been admitted to my hospital for a complication for a vaccine regarding uh, myocarditis or endocarditis. I That's not to say it doesn't happen. I'm
It's a
sure it
few
does, but
cases
it's
per million.
never.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's like compared to everything in medicine is always a risk benefit, and the way I like to say it with risk benefit is, you know, there's a chance when you get in your car today that you're going to get into a car accident and die horribly. Um, and it's but the benefit of I need to get to this place in the next hour outweighs kind of that small risk that you take. Um, and it's kind of the same thing with vaccines. Vaccines, I wouldn't ever say a vaccine is 100% safe. Every time we give a vaccine, we give out a data sheet that says, hey, monitor for these side effects. My uncle got the COVID vaccine. He had a fall because it made him have a fever and it made him just a little loopy for a day. I wouldn't say that there's no possible risk of complications ever, but the benefit outweighs the risk. If my uncle got COVID, he would probably die. At least at the time when we were giving those COVID vaccines for sure.
Hmm. Yeah,
Um,
and even these particular ailment, right? Myocarditis in particular is 7 to 12 times more likely to occur from COVID infection, and more severely as well.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, just before finishing, I definitely want to give you a chance to talk about Pierre, your general impression of him, and yeah, just have at it.
Um, Pierre Kory, I find interesting because I'd taken some notes after reading your or watching your debate. And some of the things that I found kind of rather stunning just were there seems to be this desire to have recognition. I noticed it early on and when he mentioned corticosteroids and nobody listened to him about corticosteroids. Now, obviously, we went in. to using corticosteroids, dexamethasone has been amazing at treating COVID. I have no way of telling if he actually proposed that internally. And I don't know if maybe he did run into some pushback. Unfortunately, healthcare is a little bit of a bureaucracy, you know, but it seemed early on like I feel like he wanted some recognition. And then he made his pitch to Congress about ivermectin. And it seems like ever since then, he's just doubled down and doubled down. Um, you know, we make mistakes in healthcare all the time. I'm sure, we're all human. Everyone makes errors. The important thing is to catch those errors and say, how do we prevent repeating them? And in fact, over the years in healthcare, we've developed very robust systems of reporting when errors happen and trying to find out a root cause that's really not punitive. So if Pierre Kory had made that pitch to Congress and then came out and said 6 months down the line, a year later, I made a mistake, data didn't pan out, I probably would feel a little bit better about him. Instead, what he did was he was a member of the Frontline COVID Critical Care Alliance, or whatever they call it.
Right, FLCCC.
Yeah. And quite frankly, what I've seen with that group is something that feel like I've seen with a lot of other pseudoscience, pseudo medicine topics, such as, people who purport miracle mineral solutions, which is drinking bleach, other items of, other items of pseudo medicine, where now it's kind of shifted into ivermectin is this panacea. Quite frankly, and that scares me at a certain point. We in medicine, a lot of our protocols that we have for COVID, stuff like remdesivir, we strictly use that at this point for COVID. I'm sure there's probably a couple other niche uses, but I'm not going to come out here and say everyone should be taking remdesivir. It's the most amazing drug ever. It'll cure this, it'll cure that. And I think what frustrates me most about Pierre, and you touched on this in your debate with him, and it's the first time I've ever seen somebody say this to somebody's face like Pierre. You called him a murderer, which is probably pretty apt in my opinion. Did he directly cause those deaths? No, but we have this concept in medicine and nursing of informed consent. With the disinformation he gave throughout the pandemic and went viral with, he robbed these patients of being informed. And thereby he just robbed them entirely of their best chance at survival. And I don't know if it's an ego thing, if it's money.
I think it's a combination. I think that it's began as an ego thing, like you said, wanting recognition, then realizing that this was an avenue to a much larger income than he ever made as a doctor. So that's it.
Yeah, and I mean, what's also frustrating is just the fact that I think at one point he had mentioned, we didn't talk really about this, but I had watched the measles portion of his debate, which, by the way, I found it funny at about the 1 hour mark when Steve Kirsch took over, and you just have to have Pierre Kory sitting there like this, listening to the dumbest thing ever.
Yeah. Just wishing, just thinking, why did I agree to this debate?
Yes,
this is going
but
horribly.
I find it funny that he mentioned that there were 2 deaths from measles that are slam dunk lawsuits, yada yada.
Yeah.
And the one portion that stuck out to me was he claimed that he had a case where that to this day gives him nightmares. And I'm sitting here thinking, well, I still have nightmares about everything I saw in the pandemic. I mean,
Yeah,
what
and
do
that he
you?
helped to cause. There are so
Yeah,
many
what?
thousands of people that were in the hospital that shouldn't have been there because they should have gotten vaccinated instead of sitting there waiting for ivermectin to come in the mail that wasn't going to help them an ounce. So he
Yes.
is responsible for these nightmares for other people. Yeah.
Um, and I don't want to poo-poo poor me. Realistically, I mean, part of the reason I wanted to talk to you was just I don't think anyone has advocated for what these people went through. I think I mentioned in my initial email to you that um, this was a disease that killed more Americans in 2 years than the entirety of World War II. And history is going to forget because I'm bound by HIPAA to not talk about specifics necessarily. I could talk in general terms, but nobody's going to remember any of these deaths. I'm sure some of the families do. But at the end of the day, nobody's there to speak for what these people went through.
Hmm. On that note, just what's one thing that you wish you could convey to the general public who don't understand what healthcare workers do and what their ethos is? How can you help them see you in a more accurate light?
That's a very good question. I haven't thought about. I guess what I'd say is that at the end of the day, we're human. And I'm sure people have had bad experiences in healthcare. I certainly have had bad experiences. I think it's important to keep in mind that, especially in the hospital, I could go from one room where I just had to deal with somebody who died horribly. And I have to go into the next room without even processing it and act like nothing happened.
Hmm.
Um, Now, is that to say that you shouldn't advocate for yourself as a patient? You shouldn't. No, but I think there needs to be a little bit of understanding as to what we go through as healthcare workers. And it's not a perfect system. It's far from it. I tell people a lot of the time that when you go to the hospital, you're kind of essentially at the DMV. You're going to be waiting. You get to the waiting room and then you get admitted and you have some tests. You have to wait for the doctor to get those tests. And then if you actually get admitted to a hospital from the ER, then you're going to be waiting for that doctor. We give you meds. Then you're going to be waiting to see the response to those meds. It's all a waiting game. And we try our best to kind of keep in mind the human being at the end of it. But at the end of the day, I mean, it's all a very big machine that we're working with. And my job as a nurse is to try to help patients navigate it as best I can.
Yeah. And we should we should be focusing on how to smooth out the bureaucracy from the top down rather than trying to throw accusations at well-meaning healthcare workers who are just there trying to do the best they fucking can, you know?
Well, this is a tangent that I could go into, but quite frankly, I would say one of the beacons during the pandemic was Dr. Fauci. Um, and I don't know if you want to include this at all, but to see how that man was demonized ever since COVID is beyond understanding. In a way, it feels like a slap in the face to healthcare workers around the country.
I'm actually planning a video on that topic just to sort of like exonerate slash expose the insanity with which about how science deniers just target and demonize individuals. It's pretty crazy.
Well, seeing how he was treated, I was almost apprehensive to even speak out, but
Mhm.
because I'm sure even just with my first name, people can try to find me, and we'll see. I'm willing to take that risk. I'm at the
Mhm.
point now where I'm a bit jaded in my career, and I just whatever.
Yeah. Well, I do thank you for your perspective. Yeah, hopefully this won't come back to you in any significant way. I don't think it will. But yeah, it takes as many people as possible to speak out and offer their perspective and help the viewer come to an informed stance on what everyone's saying, what's happening, and who can be trusted. So, thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for your time.
Thanks, Peter. It helps to hear from the real professionals, doesn't it? For every million underpaid and underappreciated scientists and doctors putting in the real work to gather data that informs treatment protocols and saves lives, there's an asshole like Pierre who sacrifices lives with his determination to ignore all that data and stay wrong for fame and profit. Because hype and false hope will always be more popular than empirical data and statistical analysis. This is the true pandemic, the plague that threatens the survival of mankind more than any other, and there is no cure for science denial on the horizon. But as futile as it may often seem, we fight. We expose. We set the record straight. We get in the trenches, and we fight. We fight the two-bit grifters. We fight the fucking White House, and everyone in between. Because human civilization is worth fighting for. So that's it for Pierre Kory, the former doctor who loves killing people with lies for money. Sadly, this game of anti-vaxxer whack-a-mole is nowhere near complete, since more of them pop up every year. And I just made promises to debunk at least 2 more of these jerks in this very video, so I guess it's back to work for me. I'll see you next time.